How can we solve transportation problems related to crumbling infrastructure, surging congestion, poor air quality, increasing GHG emissions, and declining revenues? One proven approach is to implement a range of mobility pricing strategies, including road tolls, parking fees, gas taxes, and transit fares. Since this is easier said than done, especially in a COVID-altered world, TransportFutures.ca invites you to learn from and with international experts during our online mobility pricing conversations now underway. The final one-hour conversation, taking place on December 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, features Brendan Hemley, a transit consultant who works with clients based in Canada, the U.S., and Europe. With ridership, revenue, and equity critically impacted by the pandemic, Brendan and Transport Futures founder Martin Collier will discuss policies and strategies that transit agencies can use to balance affordability, attractiveness for riders, and financial viability. They look forward to responding to your questions and comments. Join this cutting-edge conversation, co-sponsored by Daily Commercial News, by registering today at transportfutures.ca/MPC. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media Warren Frey, and with me I have, as per usual in the middle of the month, Chief Economist for ConstructConnect, Alex Carrick, and Senior Economist, Michael Guckes. And Michael, you just mentioned off air that you were both at the building show and that you had an okay crowd for your session, but Alex had a sold-out crowd. So maybe you could both reminisce about the building show before we get into the main thrust of this thing.
Well, yeah, Alec here. Yeah, the building show was great. They had very large attendance. I think they're saying that attendance was way up over the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
A year ago, people were probably more concerned about COVID. And
I was there last year. It's my first one, but it did seem a little sparse for Toronto.
Yeah. Well, there were certainly a lot of people, and the sessions were very good. We had a long question period afterwards, and it covered a whole range of topics, really bounced around a lot. So, yeah, I thought it was great.
And Michael, how was your session? Other than, less well-populated, according to you.
No, it was great. I think that from the audience that I spoke to during the Q&A session, they are getting the message that I've been putting out there a lot in the last 18 months, which is, the opportunities within the construction space are very uneven, and there are lots of pockets of opportunity, but they're just simply not everywhere. And so we need to be using data to think more smartly about how we do work, not simply just physically working harder. And so I really enjoyed the Q&A because I think it really allowed the audience an opportunity to talk about how do we think smarter about working in 2024.
Now, I think that might tie into what we're going to be talking about, because what I want to do is, as is usual with the media, we don't want to do a year-end thing and then like a little look afterwards into the future, which I think that'll tie into. But let's start with the past. 2023, what do you guys think, and either you can start, were the big economic stories specifically for construction or just generally?
Oh, well, one of the biggest stories, and it's one of the biggest in a very long time, is the energy transition. And that's about the whole effort to go off fossil fuels towards renewables. And the implication of that is that you have all these mega construction projects, particularly in the United States more than in Canada. Mm-hmm. And so many of these projects are tied to manufacturing and industrial processes, and it's electric vehicle plants, and it's and even the chip making and so on, bringing jobs back to America. There's never been anything in my memory like the last 2 years in terms of mega projects. Mm-hmm. The highest number, the highest dollar volume ever. And so and a lot of that's tied to energy transition, and it's tied to trying to bring jobs back to America from overseas. And then there's a couple of other things. There's the labor shortage issue, of course, and there's the commercial real estate market, which is still a concern. And I know Michael's done a lot of work in that area because the high office vacancy rates they're not going away anytime soon, apparently. And then, of course, another one is the high interest rates and what that has done to residential construction. It seems to have cut into that activity more in the US than in Canada, and can get into more of that in a minute. But turning it over to Michael.
So many of my comments, I think, mirror exactly what Alex just said. On the US side, right, we see opportunities in a lot of places, right? We are still essentially redesigning, right, our energy infrastructure. And there's a whole host of related industries that will benefit from that, right? So we have transportation terminals. Alec and I were just going over the other day, the billions of dollars that are being spent on transportation terminals in the coming years. And, if we look at our starts forecast in the future, right, transportation terminals is one of those very opportunistic areas where we see really good growth in 2024 and beyond, right? So that's just one example. But to keep going with some of the other points Alec made, and I fully agree with, there's a lot of there's highly leveraged parts of the CRE market. Offices and apartments happen to be two of those areas based on some research that we're doing here. And that becomes a concern because, just like Alex said, these things have to be refinanced. You end up with offices and apartments and other CRE properties that don't get 30-year mortgages like we do in the US for houses. These types of CRE debt usually have a duration of 5 years, thereabouts. Can be a little longer, can be shorter. And as those properties are refinancing, they're turning over. And I think in the next 2 years, there's $1.4 trillion of that debt that needs to be refinanced in total. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, with today's higher rates hurting returns on investment. And there's other things too out there that are also a challenge. The cost of insuring these properties, I believe that's going up by about a third, according to some experts I work with. Right, so we have higher mortgage rates, we have higher insurance costs, we just have higher costs overall. And so when you're in one of these markets where, like Alex said, you have high vacancy rates, or you have pricing that has essentially maybe hit its climax for the at least in the near term, that creates a very difficult operational picture, right, for those CRE owners. Revenues are essentially plateauing or struggling, I should say, in one way or another, while at the same time your costs are certainly increasing, right? And so we have that going on right now. And then at the same time, when you look at the rate at which work is in progress, right, we have things that are half built and they're on their way to completion, and we see these things and they're at very high levels. And so you have all this additional supply coming onto the market, is my concern, at the same time that we're seeing somewhat of a climax in the market. So these are the things that have me a little nervous with 2024. But again, why I keep saying, so big deal. There is an opportunity everywhere, but there are still opportunities, like I pointed out at the beginning of my comments, for us to grow our businesses and to grow the construction industry.
Now, I was just going to ask Alice, because I was thinking about this, and I think this is less of a thing in the States than it is here, but there's a lot of provincial pushback to federal stuff like the carbon tax. And whereas, and this is completely anecdotal, when I was at ConExpo, didn't matter what political stripe somebody was, they were all for the Infrastructure Act because it got them work. Like they couldn't care less. I just didn't sense that the government is bad. Whereas I'm getting a lot more of that out of Canada now with Saskatchewan and Alberta specifically, but other stuff too, people pushing back at the federal government on some of these environmental initiatives and trying to convert our infrastructure, whereas it seems like there's a lot less of that in the States. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. You guys are the economists here.
Well, certainly in the United States, there's a lot of pushback on it because there's the whole question about whether it's even going to be successful. Because when you think about this energy transition, it all depends on one thing. And that is everybody moving to buying electric vehicles. And I'm increasingly reading articles where people are saying that this just isn't viable and so on. Now, this is going to happen because these big trends that occur in history, they roll on regardless. There's a whole bunch of bumps in the road. And I do believe that this is going to happen, but certainly there's a lot of talk about it. And if it's going to happen, so there are certain things that are going to have to transpire. But this is getting into the outlook. And one of the things is that there's going to have to be a lot more charging stations. I love buzzwords. I like it when I learn a new phrase that's come up that people love. And what they're now talking about is the handshake. And what the handshake is the connection between the cord that goes from the recharging apparatus into your car. And it looks like Tesla's going to win that battle to have the common handshake approach, but it hasn't happened yet. I think it's GM and Ford have agreed that they're going to use the Tesla model. But that's going to happen, and range is going to have to be extended, and so on. So there's a lot of things. There. In terms of institutional work, and I'm kind of bouncing around here, but it's interesting. And I don't know what this says about the two economies. I hesitate to draw conclusions here. But when I talked about mega projects in the institutional category, and Michael and I were going over all these big projects yesterday, the U.S. has a whole bunch of giant prisons that are being built.
True.
Whereas in Canada, the mega projects in the institutional category, and this is reviewing the past, so that's why I'm on this, but it's hospital projects. And that's government money. And the difference is that in the States, hospital projects, there's a lot of private money or religious organization money or academic money, because things like teaching hospitals are at the academic level, whereas in Canada, the big hospitals are almost all provincial federal money. So in a review of 2023, those are interesting. And well, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, and you've mentioned before, Michael, about how the problem with electrical vehicles is going to be the infrastructure part of it, not the vehicles themselves.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting because a lot of, I think, really top-notch journals are capturing just how big the challenges are with all of this, right? The Wall Street Journal and the Economist come to mind, but so much of what the U.S. is doing in terms of solar cell production, or the all the infrastructure for the EVs and all the other electric plants. Essentially, what we're doing is we're transitioning everything over so that it runs on electricity, right? That's essentially another way of looking at what we're doing, right? So there's a lot more copper involved. There's a lot more lithium that has to be found. All these other products, and the real bottleneck is in the higher levels of the supply chain, where we don't have the lithium yet, right? We need to come up with the facilities and the mining sites to produce the raw materials. And then once we have that, we need to create all these other facilities, manufacturing plants, et cetera, to replace essentially what we're getting from abroad. If the politicians decide to continue down this path of sort of self-determination from a manufacturing perspective, right? And so that will create a whole nother wave of issues. But right now, of course, we're pretty far back in the overall course of that, right? And that also, by the way, that speaks nothing to this whole idea in America about upping our military production capabilities, right? The whole reason why the Allies won World War II is because we could produce planes and bombers and tanks and other things much faster than the other side, and that was huge. And we're seeing big problems with just that kind of a numbers game when we look at a place like Taiwan or Ukraine or the Middle East, right? And so there's all of this excitement as well around that. And so we have all of these things happening. Big industries are understanding just how much of an emphasis there is in the very near future to ramp up production and manufacturing. That's going to create an incredible opportunity for the construction industry, right? So like I was saying, for all those firms that have been focused on maybe offices and apartments, and now they're getting a little nervous because of the dynamics of those industries in the near term, right? There are plenty of places, right? Alec and I have listed probably half a dozen in just the last 10 minutes that maybe we can have our our audience start turning to and considering a little more deeply, right? So again, those opportunities are out there as the politicians, do what they're going to do, and as just market forces do what they're going to do. I think, hopefully, while there's a lot of change going on, right? Change doesn't have to be good, right? I think for what we see in the future out years of our forecast, right? Change can be a very positive thing because change creates so much possible opportunity right now.
So I guess we've kind of almost wandered into 2024 already anyway, but let's get your takes. What do you think is going to be the big thing or the big things that we're going to be looking at in 2024?
The number one thing that's going to influence construction in 2024 is when interest rates start to decline. And because so much is being held off, so much activity right now is being held off in the anticipation that rates will start to come down by the Fed and the Bank of Canada, probably after Q1 or Q2. And certainly people aren't going to buy a house knowing that they can get a better financial bargain if they just wait a little bit longer. So that's one. For Canada, it's the population growth. It's just amazing. Population growth in Canada is over 3% per year. And that has phenomenal implications for things like residential construction, because, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is saying that we need all these extra housing units by 2030. And that means upping annual housing starts from, say, around 250,000 to something like 350 to 400,000, and we're still not going to meet the objectives. Another one is electric power. Everybody's trying to increase electric power capacity. Labor shortage is still going to be an issue. Though the one thing that I would say to really watch for in Canada, and this is more of a general economic thing than a specific construction thing, but once it's going to have a tremendous impact on GDP in the country and a lot of other things. It's going to have these knock-on effects when we open the first major LNG project in the Northwest British Columbia, shipping to Asia, and also when oil finally starts to move, not just north-south, but from east to west through the Trans Mountain pipeline project.
Which is just about done, yeah.
Yeah, and both of them are almost done, and they're going to make quite a considerable difference to national output in Canada. So those are the things I think to watch for.
Okay, Michael, it's America's
turn. I'll make one brief comment about Canada, and then I'll mention a few things about the U.S., although I think I've pretty much already given my best punchlines away. But in the last few conferences I've presented at, I talk about, if you look at the top 10 exports out of Russia, and you look at Canada's full list of what it exports, there's a lot of alignment at the top here. And so one of the comments I've made recently is, if you add up the sum of Russia's top 10 exports, it comes out to about $450 billion. And a lot of those, Canada already has a really strong export market in those areas as well. That's huge, right? That's 15% of GDP thereabouts. So that's huge. If things continue to just work the way they are, and certain states continue, or nations, I should say, continue to act as pariahs, right? It creates huge opportunities there as well. And I think it really speaks to what Alec was saying about the infrastructure to move goods and products, not only within and across Canada and across North America, but even, as he mentioned, right, to continents abroad. So that was the one thing I wanted to mention about Canada. When it comes to the U.S., if you look at our starts forecast, the latest one that we released, right, there are lots of opportunities in a couple different areas, right? Within commercial, we see growth in hotels and motels, and even shopping and retail. Those areas, we see really strong opportunities for growth in 2024. Transportation terminals, I already mentioned that one, but again, also big opportunities for growth there, double-digit increases between 2023 and 2024. And then just one more time, right? Talking about all those total engineering projects, the large civil projects that are out there, especially power, right? And all of us here have been talking about that energy transformation. That's going to have big ramifications in a good way for power and other miscellaneous civil projects in our outlook, right? Things like also water and sewage treatment, right? Big necessities, and yet we don't talk about them because they're not particularly glamorous, right? Things that are under the ground don't get talked a lot about, out of sight, out of mind, but those have huge opportunities out there as well for the construction industry. So lots of things are going on out there in the engineering world that I think all of North American construction firms should be very much tracking for the sake of building a solid long-term multi-year strategy and for building your revenues over, not just next year, but many years out.
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
Well, I like that Michael brought up the sewer and water main topic because there's things going on there that you don't think about. And things like, because there's all these mega projects, the owners of them, they want to protect those projects. So that means that there's a whole category of infrastructure that is might be referred to as resilient infrastructure or protective infrastructure. So that these projects, these really big engineering work, civil works for the most part, when they're damaged by storms or whatever, they can be brought back on stream faster. So the people in that sector, which is not a glamorous sector, they have tremendous opportunities that they haven't had in the past. Now, the one final thing that I would mention is data centers, because there's almost an unlimited demand for data centers, because all of our lives are going into the clouds. And that doesn't mean literal clouds. That means servers in these very large structures that use a lot of electricity. And that's why Quebec is really making a push for these, because Quebec has green electricity through hydroelectric. But if you think about going into the clouds, our lives going into the clouds, and you think about the need for data centers, just think about the things that are going on in technology, virtual reality, digital twin cities, twin buildings when you're designing projects and so on. And then there's artificial intelligence, and there's cryptocurrency, and there's cybersecurity, and there's blockchain accounting. All those things are reasons for having even more computer capacity and computer speed. So the need for data centers is going to continue to be immense, I say, big.
And they're going to want to be local too. They don't want those overseas, right? Like where they've had that liability before. Sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead,
That's a great. There's a lot of thinking that goes on behind where do we put a data center, and it was really interesting. I read a report, not all that old either, that talked about how Northern Virginia is the data center capital of the world. And it seems like an odd place to put it because everything is very expensive out there, right? So why do it? And the reason why they said that Virginia naturally became, or Northern Virginia became the data center capital of the world is because there was a lot of excess electricity. The grid had the excess capacity to feed those data centers. There are places that would make great sense, geographically speaking, to host data centers in Asia, in Singapore and Hong Kong and other places like that, where even if they're on the outskirts somewhere, it would make more operational sense to put them in places in Asia. The problem there is that they don't have the excess capacity to run those kinds of data centers. They would literally have to build standalone electricity facilities just to power the data centers. And so there's this catch-22 involved with where do you put these data centers? And so again, to the point that Alex has made several times, right, is the importance of power. Power generation is going to mean so much, not just for itself, but for other industries that are tangential to it. And all of that will help construction.
All right, I think that's just about it for 2023, literally and figuratively. So I guess I'll talk to you guys in early 2024. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and have a great holiday there, guys, and same to all our listeners.
Yes, agreed.